Before setting off on a combat mission, which could last up to 12 weeks, the submarine was loaded to maximum capacity. Its compartments could hold up to 14 tons of various supplies, including fresh provisions and a full combat load. All fuel tanks were filled to capacity. There was virtually no free space left inside. Passageways, shelves, and even some technical niches were filled with boxes of food. Eggs, fruits, vegetables, meat, all of this was stored in any suitable niche. First, perishable foods were eaten to prevent spoilage, and then the crew switched to canned food. The diet was supplemented with beverages. Tea, coffee, cocoa, juices, and milk were available on board, although supplies of these products were also limited. There was no question of comfort in such conditions. The submarine's interiors were extremely cramped: narrow passageways, low ceilings, metal surfaces, and minimal personal space. When surfaced, especially in stormy weather, water penetrated the boat through the hatchways. Each splash threatened to flood the passageways and compartments. The situation was no better when submerged. Due to the temperature difference between the warm air inside and the cold seawater outside, condensation constantly accumulated on the walls, dripping down the bulkheads and wetting everything around it. Service in warm latitudes was especially difficult. Poor ventilation, stuffiness, the smell of machine oil, diesel fuel, sweat, and smoke, all this turned the interior of the boat into a kind of floating bathhouse. The temperature in the engine room could reach 50 degrees Celsius and was considered normal. There were no showers on submarines. You could only wash yourself from your personal flask or rare containers of fresh water, which was saved to the last drop. All this together, the heat, the inability to take a shower, the constant stuffiness, sweat, and limited space, made staying on a submarine a real test even for the most resilient sailors. The interior of the boat was almost completely occupied by engines, batteries, mechanisms, and pipelines. There was very little space left for the submarine crew. Living conditions were extremely cramped. There was a constant shortage of sleeping quarters on submarines. Sailors and petty officers slept wherever they could find a free space. The main thing was to be able to stretch out to full height. Often, torpedoes in the equipment compartments, boxes of provisions, shelves between mechanisms, and sometimes just the floor became places to sleep. This was considered normal. Only the submarine commander enjoyed relative comfort. He was the only one of the entire crew who had a private cabin. But to call it a full-fledged room would be an exaggeration. The cramped space barely fit a narrow bed and a small folding table. In addition, this cabin was located next to the central control station, where there was constant hustle and bustle, signals, commands, the noise of equipment, and the footsteps of those on duty. There was no question of peace and quiet. The officers' cabins were double, with folding bunks located one above the other. Senior officers most often slept on benches intended for eating, and ordinary submariners slept in hammocks fixed between pipes and mechanisms, or simply on the floor, under the equipment. A common practice was the so-called hot bunk. One bed was used by two sailors in turn. While one was on watch, the other rested. This rotation helped to organize life in conditions of extreme space shortage. The most uncomfortable sleeping places were in the bow and stern of the submarine, where the noise level was particularly high due to the proximity of torpedo tubes, pumps, diesel engines, and auxiliary mechanisms. The submariners had to fall asleep to the constant hum, vibration, and grinding of the equipment, often without even taking off their uniforms. Another serious problem was the lack of fresh water. They tried to use it only for cooking and for the operation of vital equipment. Personal hygiene was kept to a minimum. There was no proper washing, let alone showering. Shaving was rare. There was neither time nor facilities. Moreover, fresh water was also needed for shaving, and this was considered an unnecessary luxury. Submariners returned from long voyages not only tired, but also heavily bearded, with faces gray from dirt. At one point, German chemists developed a special soap that retained its cleansing properties even in seawater, but it did not completely solve the problem. It was difficult to shave with this soap, and only a few used it. As for sanitary conditions, a typical submarine had only 2 toilets, extremely few for a crew of 50 or more people. Moreover, at the beginning of the voyage, one of the toilets was often converted into a storage room, filling it with boxes of food. Thus, there was only one functioning toilet left for all crew members, which created considerable difficulties and led to constant queues. It is not difficult to imagine the inconvenience this caused the crew. Life on a submarine was not just a job, but a harsh and exhausting test, both physically and mentally. The engine room was particularly harsh, a veritable hell inside the submarine. It was there that the powerful six-cylinder diesel engines, about 6 meters long, operated with a terrifying roar. The noise was so loud that it was impossible to hear even your own thoughts near the running engines. Powerful vibrations were transmitted to the hull, floor, and walls, literally shaking you to the bone. The crew had to work in such conditions for several hours at a time. Many mechanics and motorists who spent a long time in the engine room eventually lost some or all of their hearing. The vibrations and constant roar of the diesel engines took their toll. The galley, the ship's kitchen, was no less cramped. It was located in a narrow passageway, which barely accommodated 2 electric stoves, a couple of cupboards, and a small metal table. Cooking had to be done literally on one's knees, in a confined space, among swaying boxes of provisions, in constant stuffiness. When the boat was above water, cooking became practically impossible. The strong rocking and the risk of flooding made it too dangerous. Therefore, the cooks, the ship's chefs, tried to prepare food when the boat was underwater, where it remained relatively stable. But even under these conditions, the food quickly lost its taste and aroma. In compartments reeking of diesel fuel and sweat, it was impossible to preserve either the freshness of the food or one's appetite. After a few weeks of sailing, the air inside the boat turned into a suffocating cocktail. It was filled with a mixture of diesel exhaust, machine oil vapors, damp sweat, unwashed bodies, rotten food, and human excrement. This multi-layered aromatic cloud did not dissipate but accumulated in the compartments, permeating everything around it: clothes, bunks, upholstery, even skin. To somehow muffle the stench, submariners used cologne everywhere. They poured it on bunks, pillows, walls, clothes. They didn't spare it. In some cases, bottles of cologne were used literally as air fresheners, sprayed by hand. This alleviated the unbearable stench a little, but created another problem: a heavy, nauseating smell of alcohol mixed with rot and sweat. Submarine commanders were well aware of how difficult it was for their subordinates, both mentally and physically. To boost morale, they organized impromptu contests and competitions right inside the submarine. These could be intellectual puzzles, word games, mini competitions for dexterity or accuracy in narrow passages. But the main and most coveted prize was almost always the opportunity to go outside, onto the bridge, and breathe some real fresh air. This right became a rare privilege, especially valuable when the crew had already spent weeks or even months of confined existence in a cramped, smelly, stuffy space. Despite all the horrors and hardships of submarine service, cramped quarters, the inability to maintain basic hygiene, chronic sleep deprivation, harsh working conditions, and the constant threat of death, this service had certain incentives that were considered significant even in wartime. First, submariners received increased monetary allowances. Their salaries were significantly higher than those of soldiers and officers in the regular army. This was due to the extreme danger of the service and the fact that the submarine crew was on constant combat alert even during transitions, literally every minute. Second, service on a submarine ensured rapid advancement in rank and position. A young sailor could advance to petty officer or officer faster than his peers on land. This made the submarine fleet attractive to ambitious sailors. In addition, there was another extremely valuable advantage that was especially appreciated in the conditions of a protracted and exhausting war: regular leave. After completing each combat mission lasting up to 12 weeks, almost half of the crew went on 12 days of leave. Those who remained performed routine tasks of unloading, repairing, and preparing the boat, and then they were also replaced, and they got their well-deserved break. As a result, while the submarine was at the base, almost the entire crew had time to rest. It is important to emphasize that this leave was organized at a high level. Submariners were not simply left at the base or sent to the nearest garrison. They were transported home to Germany on special express trains reserved exclusively for submarine crews. This allowed the sailors not only to rest physically, but also to be close to their loved ones and families, even despite the raging war. Thus, every submariner, provided they successfully completed their voyage and returned to port, could count on a 2-week vacation at home at least once every 6 months. This looked especially contrasting against the reality of other fronts. For example, on the Eastern Front, soldiers often did not see their homes and did not receive leave for 12 to 18 months, and sometimes they died without ever being discharged. However, such privileges came at a tremendous cost. The German submarine fleet suffered some of the heaviest losses of any branch of the armed forces during World War II. Of the approximately 40,000 submariners who served aboard submarines, about 30,000, 3/4 of all those who served, did not return home.